Hello, welcome to Marcelian Online, and 11.1 has just hit, so we are going to be looking at the easiest range DPS to play versus the hardest, because that's important to know if you're going to be pushing content, getting into keys, or just wanting to have a good old fun time. But I think I have a good grasp on which ones would be the easiest and the hardest based off of the changes that they suffered. And let's just get into it, bro, because the first one that we have today is Affliction Warlock. Didn't really see much change or any change at all, much to the chagrin of the afflictions of the world, and it kind of plays the same. Now, whether it's difficult or easy, of course, that always applies to the individual, but in the general scheme of things, I think this is a pretty good middle ground in terms of affliction. It can have some annoyances slash complexity slash what do you do when your Vile Taint is on cooldown and you want to apply AoE dots on everything, but the pack is about to die? Do you individually tap target to put all the dots up? Do you use a Vile Taint and then just go into the next pack with no ways to apply AoE? Like, that is a question that needs to be answered. While in single target, it can get a little bit difficult to maintain properly your dots. And considering that this raid has a lot of AoE slash cleave slash there's more than one target to hit, managing dots on multiple targets at the same time can get a little bit hectic. So it could go up or down based off the type of encounter you play and maybe also the build. And speaking of the builds, we are also building towards Season 2 with a lot of cool stuff like our new player profile that is graciously supported by our Patreons that we want to thank. You make a lot of this possible and keep the lights up here at Marcelian Online. And if you want to support us as well, dear viewer, you can check the link below to patreon.com/Marcelian Online. And among supporting cool projects like our new player profile, which is free for everybody, you will get cool perks as well that only patrons do get, like access to bloopers, since I'm not that smooth and cool and crisp on camera. There's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. Also, wallpapers with your coolest character of your choice, customized and immortalized in 4K glorious resolution, so you can slap on your desktop while you game World of Warcraft, and a bunch of other things down to patreon.com/Marcelian Online. The link is down below as well. Thank you so much for supporting the content and making all of this possible, and more cool things to come in the future. So let's look at augmentation. Now, depending on what World of Warcraft content you consume, or if you consume any whatsoever, people are saying augmentation is dead. Does that matter in terms of how easy and hard it is to play? Maybe, maybe not, because part of why a lot of people don't like augmentation is probably to do with raiding, and there's like different things in Mythic Plus and Raid, but that is because of the difficulty that's implicit to augmentation. In raids, in order for you to execute your proper buffing of the targets, and if you want to be efficient, you need a lot of add-on help slash weak aura slash who needs my buffs the most out of everybody in the raid. If you want to play at that level, augmentation can probably go hard, or maybe even hardest, or at least very, very annoying. While in Mythic Plus, if you play augmentation and you want to dish out the most amount of help and support possible, it's kind of implied that you're doing very, very high keys and bleed dispels and keeping your party members alive and stuff like that, which is kind of going away, is kind of implied as well. So that's a little bit harder to use to rank augmentation. So I will try to be a little bit middle groundy, but also look at the actual playstyle. In terms of executing your rotation, it's not actually hard at all. Augmentation is one of the simpler specs, so I would probably put it in around easy level, but because there's like abstract levels of difficulty to augmentation to making it useful, I would normally bump it down to hard. So the middle ground would probably be around Affliction in terms of okay, but the spec has been gutted so much that I don't even know if it's worth playing it from what people are saying. So does that mean that it has no difficulty? Does that mean that you're just doing damage? It's kind of anybody's guess at this point. I think Tettles from the Bench podcast said it right, if you listen to those kinds of things, where they might be gearing up for a whole rework for augmentation. And if that's the case, then ranking it here is a little bit pointless, but I will put it kind of middle of the pack. There are aspects of it that are incredibly easy depending on which content you play it in, and aspects that can be incredibly tedious to engage with. Balanced Druid, I would probably put it in the easy track. It has one of the most simple rotation ever for better or worse. Some people like it, some people don't. It's also a very deterministic rotation. It doesn't have any RNG whatsoever, maybe slight RNG with maybe shooting stars, generating a little trickles of astral power and doing damage. But outside of that, there are no RNG procs that I am aware of, with the exception of Elun's Chosen that procs random Fury of Elune. Listen, there might be some RNG with Balanced Druid, okay, but it doesn't really impact what you do in your rotation. It's just that sometimes you might have an influx of resources that you have to spend a little bit quicker than what you would expect. That actually is very relaxing when you play a spec and you're kind of like in charge of your entire rotation, but it doesn't have any depth or complexity or maybe cool, interesting points either, until it might get a rework or not. But until then, it remains easy. Where it might get a little bit harder to play Balanced Druid is when you engage to the actual Druid kit. When do you shift into Bear? How long do you stay into Bear? Do you also pop a Frenzy Regen? Do you start to use your utility? How many utilities do you get? Do you get both Ursal and Typhoon? Do you use them in a combo? Do you use them separately? That's a little bit abstract, similar to Augmentation, as to how you use your kit to engage with the game. And the fact that Balanced Druid is a Druid, and it has a wide spectrum of utility that can be used in a lot of different ways, and knowing those ways can be the complexity that comes along with the spec. Arcane Mage is also kind of in a weird situation like Augmentation, where it's undergoing some changes because the devs have recognized that maybe it's a little bit weird to have to use a weak card to tell you when to barrage. That's something that I personally completely ignored because I've played Arcane mostly for fun, and I just shot barrage up when I had my charges or my procs, and that was about it. And if you play like that, it's not that hard, but it does have some unintuitive ways to play. I think it's probably gearing up to being easier and easier as the changes / reworks to it continuously happen over the course of the next patches, couple of months. Hopefully by midnight they have a clear view of what Arcane is supposed to be, because right now, although it's a very fun spec to play, which is not what the tier list is about, it can be a little bit daunting for new players to get into. And if you're fine with unintuitive rotations and fine looking things up online on guides or discords or stuff like that, then you're fine playing Arcane as well. Beast Mastery is probably the easiest. I mean, listen, you might be cringing at the fact that I'm hesitating right now, but hear me out on this. Beast Mastery is definitely easy. It's not as easy as it once used to be, especially at the time when it started to gather all these memes of being a 2 to 3 button spec. Until in a single target, depending on the builds that you will be using, and if you use stuff like Bloodshed, you have a pretty hefty opener that can rack up quite a few globals in very specific ways. So that's very unintuitive when you think, oh, I just need to keep up Frenzy and maybe Beast Cleave and AoE and that's it. It's not complex. I would recommend this to new people. It's maybe one of the easiest range specs to go, but thinking that you don't really have to think about anything at all and you just press your buttons is obviously not the way to approach Beastmaster or really any other spec on this tier list. But other than that, it has a similar difficulty curve with its utility when it comes to how Druid approaches combat, where you have options in utility. Sometimes they can work in unintuitive ways where disengage sometimes breaks some dots that also apply a slow or root or anything like that. If you run the whatever dispels your movement impairing abilities with a non-moving impairing ability, sometimes Feign Death works with certain affixes that is not very obvious. So that can probably bump it down to maybe easy, maybe okay, but that's probably a long stretch. So we're going to keep it in the easiest tier at the moment. Demonology is fairly similar to Affliction as well. I struggle to see any particularly difficulty when playing this spec. I'm sure there are intricate ways of interacting with your mechanics, with your rotations, with your procs, with your dogs, depending on which hero talent you play. I'm probably going to put it in the okay tier, considering that it's lost Nether Portal some time ago, which was the complex part of Demonology, but also the annoying part of Demonology. That's gone. So now it's a little bit more intuitive, it's a little bit more straightforward, and much easier to pick up for a lot of people. But as with all specs in the game, it has a layer of difficulty and complexity that once you dive deep into, you'll find that there's multiple things that you can do to improve and perfect your playstyle. Destruction Warlock also in a similar situation. Normally, Destruction Warlock is the easier spec of all of these and might still be the easiest. Do I want to put it into easy? It's similar to Balanced Druid, where the rotation is simplistic and intuitive. Not really sure if it has like actual proper RNG outside of sometimes your spells critting. I'm not even sure if critting with some of your spells generates extra soul shards. I don't think that's a thing anymore. There's a lot of little things happening to Destro. I guess with the new tier set, you might be getting procs of Channel Demon Fire, and that kind of extends your immolates up if you play that interaction. And maybe that's an RNG, but outside of that, it's a very deterministic rotation. It's very fun, it's very spammy, and people like that. I like that. And I think it's probably fair to keep it around easy tier. Fire Mage. Okay. This is going to be incredibly biased and people might disagree, but I found that people who disagree with Fire Mage are either very big experts on Fire Mage that have been playing Fire Mage for a long time and they just find it very easy and kind of part of the course, or very bad Fire Mages who have no idea what they're doing when they're playing Fire. But Fire is, I would imagine, one of the hardest specs to play in the game, mostly depending on whether you play Frostfire or Sun Fury, and if these get changed in the future. Frostfire is definitely the hardest hero talent to play for Mage, I think, in general, just because of how it interacts with its buffs and procs and how those influence your rotation. And now that you have lost a lot of your instant casts, Fire Blasts and Phoenix Flames, I don't know if it makes it easier or harder, but it definitely makes it different and a little bit less intuitive, which could probably be translated as harder. I don't know of, and I've mained Fire Mage in the Season 1, and I haven't looked at any guides or talked to any professional Fire Mages, so I don't know how to play my procs in the most efficient way possible because the game doesn't do a good job at telling me, because the spec has too many layers of complexity under it. When do I use excess fire? When do I cap resources? And you might have to cap resources with fire, and that's, again, unintuitive. And when I say this, why it's important that a spec is intuitive or not, because when a spec is intuitive, think of something very basic, like you generate combo points, and once you have enough of them, you spend them on a finisher. That is intuitive. That is basically the whole thing. But sometimes you generate different levels of combo points and you spend them on different levels of finishers, and it's only a rule to do that if there's something underlying going on beneath the scenes that sometimes procs different things that you don't know because the tooltip doesn't tell you. So that's kind of how Fire Mage is. It's a fun spec. It's different in Season 2, which is why I swapped from it as my main, but I do believe it is one of the hardest specs to optimize and one of the specs that's punished the most for fucking up your rotation. Frost Mage is kind of like totally opposite. I want to put it into easy or easiest. Now, once again, this can be biased. I haven't dived too deep into Frost Mage to know if it has like inherent super complex interactions and optimizing your rotation. I'm sure that's probably true for a lot of the specs, but overall, Frost Mage is maybe one of the easiest DPS specs to play in the game. Not necessarily a bad thing. It could use a little bit more death. It could use a couple of more interesting talents that can do and change certain things. Death Chill was an interesting addition to the War Within that I don't know if it's still being used, and it's kind of more of an annoyance on Frost Mage's part. There are some cool options in its gameplay where if you play big AoE, you have neat interactions of spamming Frozen Orb and Blizzards, but those are essentially intuitive ways of playing some interesting interactions with a spec that doesn't normally happen, as opposed to, let's say, what Fire Mage would have to go through. Outside of that, maybe sometimes executing your rotation can be tedious. It does have a lot of RNG when it comes to your procs, your Fingers of Frost and all of that, but I think it's overall probably easier than Balanced Druid and Death Warlock, so it's going to be in the most easiest specs to play. Not as easy as BM though. Marksmanship has changed with the rework in Season 2. I think it's a very good rework. I think it adds a little bit more complexity. It's not as easy to play, or it's not difficult mechanically because you kind of still do the same thing, but now certain things matter. And sometimes whenever you get a particular proc or stack up a particular buff like Streamline or so on, you might want to think a little bit on how you use it, but overall it doesn't change too much. I don't think it's arcane level difficulty, but I don't know if it's as easy as Balanced Druid and Distro. And I think part of the reason for that is maybe people haven't actually uncovered all of the secrets with the marksmanship rework yet, so people are still going into it, and I would be very comfortable putting it in the middle range of this tier list. Nothing much to say about marksmanship. It's a simplistic spell that has some deeper interactions with some of its procs. Devastation is definitely a very easy spec to play. Not the easiest, I would think, but this is debatable on whether or not it goes in the easiest, in the top of the list. But I think that's probably fair because there are some interactions that you don't encounter with other DPS specs that you have to get used to, mechanically speaking. And of course, I'm talking about the range. The range being shorter than other DPSers. If you play any other DPSers, you might like, oh, okay, I cannot stay where my brain is mechanically telling me to stay. I need to stay a little bit closer. I need to aim my breath a little bit closer. Like sometimes being closer is better. Plus, you also have stuff like deep breath, which takes you through the actual pack. That can be a very dangerous thing that you sometimes do because that can take you through frontals, through swirlies, through other things that could damage you. That has killed many an evokers, and I would know, I mained one when it was released. But outside of that, it's a fairly straightforward spec. You build up resources, you spend resources, you explode things in AoE, or you demolish things in single targets, and that's pretty much it. Elemental. Oh, okay. Normally, I would put Elemental in the hardest, and I'll see if I want to change my mind while talking about it, because fundamentally, Elemental is one of the most difficult specs to play because it has a lot of interactions. Interactions like Master of the Elements. Sometimes those interactions are nerfed to the point where they don't really matter and you kind of ignore them. When you get to ignore them, you might end up in a degenerate build like we had a couple of seasons ago where you just spam Lava Burst. That's obviously not the case now. After the rework, it's actually a really good spec. But sometimes if you end up ignoring your procs, it can be in the okay tier or maybe even easier. But when it gets to the point where all of the procs, all of the buffs, and all of the generators matter for Elemental, it might be one of the most plate spinny specs in the game. The devs have done a pretty good job at removing a lot of the bloat. Ice Fury is a offender for sure and has been for years. I feel like they're streamlining the spec a little bit more, although I'm not sure how I feel about the Primordial Wave changes because it kind of makes spreading Flame Shocks a little bit more awkward and the interactions are not very clear. I don't think it's as hard as Fire Mage, but it has the potential to be harder or even way easier. And it feels like the pendulum has swung back and forth so much that I don't really know where the spec is going, and by the time the patch is over, it might be a totally different spec like it was in Season 1. Shadow Priest is the last on the list, and Jesus, I want to put it with the Warlocks in the okay tier. I don't think inherently it's a difficult spec to pull off. I think Shadow Priest used to be a complex and difficult spec to play in the past. I feel like they've kind of neutered it a little bit. Where you might find difficulties playing a Shadow Priest is by just playing a priest in general, because you're lacking certain tools that pretty much everybody else has, tools like mobility. And you might think, oh, who cares? I'm just pressing my W and that's fine. Yes, but when most of the combat encounters are designed to be addressed by using a mobility ability and you don't really have one, and if you say feather, you are banned from having an opinion on Shadow Priest, is just too bad. Of course, you can deal with movement mechanics. It's incredibly tedious and it gives you a very small reaction window to be able to move away because you don't have a charge, you don't have a blink, you don't have a jump, you don't have a leap, you don't have anything, right? Historically, in the last couple of years, priests and Shadow Priests in particular have needed the aid of an Evoker to be able to even play the game, because Evokers can just lift you up in their graceful arms and carry on to the other side of the room. So that is a difficulty that it doesn't really happen for a lot of other specs, and engaging with that and knowing how to min-max your mobility and moving around your big weaknesses, an interrupt being also one of them, can add a little bit of depth. But I feel like overall Shadow is not that difficult. That could be my general impression. I feel like it's not even close to Arcane and Elemental, but I don't know if it's as easy as people like to think, although its basic rotation and damage rotation is fairly straightforward. And this is how the range look, at least in my opinion. I'm sure you disagree and you're gonna let us know in the comment section down below, but you can also check our melee ranking in terms of easiest to hardest, because I'm sure you will agree 100% with how we rank them in the video.